Hi, this is Kevin Trainer, and I want to welcome you to the demo on creating a W3C XML schema for data interchange. Um, we're looking at my virtual machine for my Mac, the one I've been using for all the demos so far. And this is going to be really pretty much a parallel of the example that I did when I did the DTD. So let's go find that directory that we were using. And it's under Documents. And let's look. And it's called the ASYS Student Chapter Demo. So I want to copy that because I want to create I want to change the name of this baby. And again, I don't seem to be able to change the name. So right now it's just going to be called ASYS Student Chapter Demo Copy. Okay. And I want to get rid of the DTD because I don't need the DTD. Although you may find it helpful to look at your DTD while you're creating your schema. I must confess that I've already created the schema that I'm going to do for you earlier this afternoon. So I've actually got that to look at on another monitor. So I'm not going to be peeking at my DTD, but I got to tell you, when I did create that schema, I did peek at the DTD, and there's no cheating in that. Well, maybe there's a little cheating in that, but it's okay. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that. We're going to move it to trash. Okay, and then we've got the XML document's going to be the same one. And why don't we double click on that? And I'm going to have to click on Oxygen to get it to maximize. And there it is right there. So I'm not going to be using a project right here, not in this demo. Okay. But what do I have that I don't need? Well, I've got a connection to a DTD style schema that I don't want anymore. So let's just get rid of that line and save it. So now I have an XML document that's not associated with any schema at all. Okay. So now I need to create a schema. So I need to click on File, New. And I don't have an XML schema as one of my choices in the recently used because I haven't created one on this installation on my virtual machine. That's the reason why I do the demos off the virtual machine. And so I'm going to go down to New Document and look. And in that list, it's, I think, the fourth entry, XML schema. And I'm just going to click on Create and wait for it to come up. And I want to point out here that when it came up is in a design mode. And I put, a couple of weeks from now, I put on the list of videos for you to watch, I put a demo on the schema 1.1 features and how they are implemented in Oxygen. And when you watch the tutorial video, you will see the instructor use this kind of view to work with the schema, this one that is on the Design tab. Now, typically I don't use the designers because I I need to teach my students how to work with the text, because if they know how to work with the text, they can work with any editor at all. But if you want to explore using the design view, you should feel comfortable doing that, okay? So it says it's using Schema 1.0 for the current file. The fact is we're not going to be using any of the new Schema 1.1 features, so that's okay. We'll talk about them in a couple of weeks. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the text tab, and we can see as we have a really empty document. And what do we have? Well, an XML schema is and I'm going to call that because it's a little bit shorter, even though I tend to talk about them with a longer name, the W3C XML schema language. But today I'm just going to call them XML schema, just like everybody else does. And an XML schema is an XML document. That's one of the things that people find attractive about it. You are able to author it using all the features of an XML-aware editor like Oxygen. Okay. The schema document is in a namespace. And how do we know that? Well, first of all, we see the prefixes on the element names, and that's usually a dead giveaway that that prefix is going to be associated with the namespace. And if you think back and remember, the way that we associate a namespace with the prefix with it is with the XML-NS attribute, and the characters that come after the colon become the prefix for the namespace, and the value of the attribute, that a character string should have the magic character string value that's associated with the namespace, the URI. Okay, and this URI has, like I said in the lecture, it has the format of a URL. And I don't know if you go to a browser and put this one in, if it will dereference to an actual page, but I hope that it would. It doesn't have to. Okay, so this is the namespace that says we're using the tag set with which you write XML schemas. And this other attribute here, this element form default, has to do with the way that we treat the elements with respect to whatever namespace the schema is in. And because we're beginners, the first schemas that we create are going to be not in any namespace at all. So that says that all of the elements that we create are going to be in the namespace of no namespace, okay? Which is typically what you want when you have a tag set that has no namespace, okay? So this is going to be more meaningful when we learn how to create a schema that has a namespace, which we're going to do a couple of units from now, all right? All right, now, so right now we have untitled, and let's, we had called the DTD chapter_list.dtd. Let's save this as chapter list. So we're going to use the same file name, chapter_list. Okay, and then it's automatically going to put the extension XSD on it. Okay, and that's the extension that we use for schema documents. All right. So the approach that I take, and I recommend that you take, is that, kind of the same one that I recommended for the DTD. You start at the top of the hierarchy and you work your way down. Okay, so what's at the top of the hierarchy over in this document that we have? Well, it's the element chapters. So let's declare an element called chapters. Okay, and we'll remember that we use an excess element to declare an element. And it has the name chapters. Okay, and it looks like this. Now we're going to have to say what the content model is for the element chapters. Okay, now when you declare an element, it has always a name and a type. Okay, now it's not always easy to see that, but here's the name, chapters. Okay, and if it had a very simple type like excess string, we could say type equals excess, string. Okay, and that would work out fine. Okay, now if you don't give it the name of a type in the type attribute, then you have to declare it locally. You have to enclose it. Now that's what we're going to do now, because we have a complex type and we don't want it to be one of the named types because we don't want to show that feature yet. So we have to enclose a type. Okay, and there are two kinds of types that we could use. We could use either a simple type or a complex type. And you'll remember from the lecture that simple types are uber simple. They are only plain old text. So if the type of the element includes sub-elements, or it includes an attribute and plain old text, then it's a complex type. And what we're going to have here is a sequence of chapter elements. So we're going to need to have a complex type. And it's complex because it's not simple, and simple is a very narrow set of circumstances. So very often you're going to be saying XS complex type. Okay? And we're going to use this to include the declaration of just what are the details of the complex type. And this is going to be a sequence, which is a typical thing that we're used to, and we did with the DTD. But in this case, this is going to be the, how could I call it? It's going to be the trivial case of a sequence, because it's going to be a sequence of one. And I think I mentioned in the lecture, that doesn't seem like a sequence to your average person on the street. You know, one, you know, it's like saying we have a line of one. Well, is that a line or is that one person? You know, most people think it makes 2 points to make a line, right? But in this case, we do have a line of one. And this is the trivial case of a sequence. So we have an excess element, if I could only type, and we're going to say name equal chapter. Okay? And the chapter element either has to name a type or it has to enclose a type. So the chapters, we decided to enclose a type. Okay? We decided to define that type locally. Okay? Now what we haven't done is we haven't shown how we could name a type and define that type globally. Okay, so let's try that. So we're just going to say type equals, and I always start with a capital, chapter type. So I use camel capitalization, and I didn't invent this convention for naming. I got it out of a really nice book called, I think it's called The Essential XML Schema by Priscilla Walmsley. There are two versions of it, one from 2002 and one from 2012. And most of the things that I do, I learned from her book. Okay. Oh, it's the definitive XML schema, not essential. Okay. Okay, so we have a chapter type. Now we're pointing to a type that we haven't defined yet. And then, if you remember, we can have more than one chapter, right? We can have 1, 2, 3. And we had said when we did the DTD, we're going to have at least one. So if you think about that, we do that with a max occurs. So let's say max occurs equals, and there's a keyword called unbounded. Unbounded. And I'm getting a little bulkiness from my virtual machine, from the editor in the virtual machine. But when I did this earlier, not in the virtual machine, I was getting a lot of auto completions. So when I began to tap max occurs, I got auto completion on that. And then I got a list of possible values that included unbounded. Okay? So you can expect that level of service. Okay? What about min occurs? Don't we have to say what's the minimum that it can occur? And it turns out we don't have to worry about that because that has a default value of 1. So it is 1 to unbounded, just like the plus. Okay? Now, practically speaking, this is like a file of ASYS student chapter elements, and we pretty much could deal with, 5 of them, we could deal with 500 of them, we could deal with 5,000 of them. So there's no real reason to put a bound on it. Could we say 100 and live within that for the most part? Yeah, we could, but I don't see that that really brings us anything at all. So I think unbounded makes sense because we don't have what I would call a practical limit. Any place where we would want to list them out, we could deal with them being, there being a lot, okay? So we have one error so far, and if I mouse over that and look, it finally come up and I just had left. It says the content of a non-type chapters is invalid. The element is invalid, misplaced, or occurs too often. Okay. What's wrong? It's not inside of a sequence. Well, how do I make up for that mistake? Well, I'm just going to highlight the whole thing. I'm going to hit, because I'm on the Mac, I'm going to hit Command E. On Windows, I would hit Control E. And I would say this should be, and then XS sequence. All right. Now that's going to solve that problem. But now I don't like the indentation. So I'm just going to go up to the toolbar and click on the indentation tool. It's going to be reformatted, and I kind of like that. And I'm going to save that. So that's good. Okay. Now the problem is I don't have a chapter type yet. Okay. All right. Now I always like to keep things kind of tight, so I don't like that extra line there. So a chapter type is a global type. How do we know it's global? Well, because we're going to put the declaration for it at the top level of the schema, just like we put the global declaration for the element chapters at that level. Okay. Now, how do we compare global to something else? Well, you'll recall from the lecture that local is at a lower level. So the element chapter is not declared at the top level. It's declared inline or locally. And from a practical basis, that means that we can't point to chapters, the chapter from another element in the schema. So it's only these names that are up at this top level, these global names, that are known in the rest of the schema that we're able to point to. Okay, so what do we want? Well, we want a type for chapter type. And what's going to be in a chapter? Well, if you looked at our document over here, in a chapter, we have chapter name, school web URL. We also have chapter URL. We have advisor. We have alternate advisor, or we may have more than one advisor. So that means we're going to have several sub-elements in a row, and that's starting to sound suspiciously like a sequence. So let's take a look at that. So let's go back, and we're going to create a global type called chapter type. Okay, and the construct of the name here is not accidental. Okay, because we're defining a type, I give it a name that ends in the word type. So this is a type for chapter, okay? And I start with a capital C and I have a capital T because that's my naming convention. So let's go down here and let's declare a type. Well, it's a complex type because it's a sequence. So I'm just going to go down and say I want a complex type. It has a name, and I'm just going to go up and copy that name. And paste it. So now it says chapter type. Very good. And then within that, I'm not going to forget the sequence this time. So XS sequence. All right. And then within that, I'm going to start to declare the elements. Now, the first two are easy. Chapter name and school web URL are just a plain old character data. So let's do an XS element. Name equal chapter name. Okay. And then as I'm just going to point out, for an element, you have to either specify a type, which is going to point to either one of the built-in types or a global type which you define, or you have to enclose one. Okay. Now, we're not going to enclose one because we're going to use one of the built-in types. So we're going to say type equal and XS, and we're going to do string. Okay, very good. And this can be an empty element. So we're already seeing here in this schema language that a lot of the elements, especially the element element that we declare, are not enclosing any sub-elements or text. They're just empty elements. They're just star tags with the shorthand on the end that says this is an empty element. Okay, so that's the first one. Chapter name, that always occurs. So we can take the default for min occurs and max occurs. We have the same thing for school web URL. Now, I am a lazy typist, so I'm just going to take the first one, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to put it down here and paste it. And then I'm going to take that name and I would have thought the whole name would have gone away, but it's acting a little flaky because we're in the virtual machine. And the name is equal to school web URL. Okay, and it's the same deal. This occurs exactly once. Okay, now we have another one that comes after this, chapter web URL. It's only different in that it's, oh, sorry, let me undo that. Let's do a copy instead of what I did wrong. Chapter web URL is going to be very similar. So again, I'm going to cut and paste. And instead of school, it starts out with the name chapter. Went a little too far. Chapter web URL. And this one, we don't have it on each of the elements, so we're going to have to make it optional. Now, how do you make it optional? Optional, when you think about it, min occurs equals 0. So min, and now we're getting auto-completion that I like. Min occurs 0. Okay? It's optional, so max occurs equals 1, and that's the default, so we're not going to worry about it. Okay? Now, the next thing that we have is advisor. If we look back at advisor in the document, we see that it's got sub-elements, okay? And we've got Christine Unsworth here, so we have a name and an email, okay? And so we've got some chapters that have more than one advisor. Here's one that has one advisor and one alternate advisor. So it looks like you have to have at least one advisor. And also, when you look at what sub-elements are in advisor, we'll see down at Illinois, Stephen Downey, a very busy man, as I said in a previous demo, he hasn't provided an email address. And he's not a great reader of email from my experience. He only goes after the most important ones. And so he's not inviting a lot of unsolicited email. So we can see that name is probably required, but email looks like it's optional. Okay, so let's go back and see what we're going to do. We could, if we wanted to, we could define the type for advisor in line, okay? But I'm going to show you a trick that I think there's a reason to have a global type called advisor type, okay? And when you see that we're going to reuse it, you'll see, oh, that was a good idea. So the name equals advisor, and the type equals advisor type, and camel capitalization. And how many do we have? Well, we have to have at least one. So min occurs equals, in this case, 1. So advisors are not optional, okay? And max occurs, how many could we have? Well, I'm saying that we could have a lot. Now, I don't see that we gain anything by saying that we can only have 3, because the rules are going to change from school to school. I think we're going to do well to just say it's unbounded. Okay? So there are times, like with how many occurrences of street we can have in the address, where I have to be able to print the address on an envelope. Well, then I think it makes sense to be able to set the upper bound at something like 3 or 4 or 5. But here I don't see that we gain a lot. So I'm going to do the same thing we did in the DTD. I'm going to say it's unbounded. And again, I'm going to give the slash here to say this is an empty element so that I don't have to have that end tag out there. And I haven't defined advisor type yet, so it's got a red squiggly underline. That's okay. I'll get to that. And what comes after advisor in the sequence? Well, alternate advisor. So let's do another XS element. And let's say name equals alternate advisor. Okay. And then we've got type equals. And here we see one of the benefits of being able to declare a global declaration of a type is you can use it in more than one place. So we're going to say that this is advisor type 2. Now, if we had decided to define the type of advisor in line, then we would have had to declare the type of alternate advisor in line, and then we would have redundant code. We couldn't be sure that the rules that were set for one would be the same for the other. And I think it's a good concept that they are the same. Okay? And does everybody have an alternate advisor? No. So it seems to me that we need to make this optional. And we do that by setting min occurs equal to 0. And again, we'll do the slash because it's an empty element. All right. So we're looking pretty good here. So the only thing I see so far that we need is that we've said that there's an advisor type. And of course, we know that inside of advisor and alternate advisor, we have name and sometimes email. So now we have to come up with a declaration of that type. And is it simple or complex? Well, very few things are simple types because I can only have a string in them. Okay? So it's a complex type because it has a sequence of name and sometimes email. So we're going to make this another XS complex type. And because it's a global type, it's going to have a name, and that's going to be advisor type. And a trick that I use to keep from misspelling things is just to cut the name and to paste it right into the attribute. And so now you know the plumbing works. And you also know it works because of those two red squiggly underlines on the two advisor types in the grouping up above have gone away. So that's great. So we've got, that's the name for the type. And this is going to be a sequence again. Sorry. It's going to be an XS sequence. And again, we're saying that this is, let me try this again so I get auto-completion. I don't know why. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But XS sequence. I actually forgot the point I was trying to make, so I'm sure I'll make it eventually. So we're going to enclose a declaration of the element name and a declaration of the element email. So let's do that. Access element, name equals name. That's potentially confusing. Does it have a simple type? Yes, it does. It's just going to hold a string. So we're going to say type equals access string. Okay. And again, this is an empty element. So just put the slash there. And then the next one, so we're going to always have one of those. It's required and it only occurs one time. So we don't have to code either min occurs or max occurs because their default values are 1. Okay. And now we want to create another access element. And we want its name to be email. And we want its type to be access string again. But this doesn't happen all the time. This is optional. So let's say min occurs equal 0. And again, this is an empty element, as most of the elements are empty elements. If you understand that, then you're tracking very, very well. Okay? So that's looking very good. All right, so let's take the schema that we have so far. This is going to validate most of what's in the other document. So let's go to the XML document and let's try to validate it. Oh, the validation failed. There's no schema associated with it. Oh, I took off the DTD, but I never connected it with the schema file. Well, how do I do that? Well, if you know all the characters to code, you can just code the right ones, or you can go up to the menu and click on Document, and then Schema, and then choose Associate Schema. And we're going to go to the little file folder, and it'll say what schemas are in our directory. Oh, chapter list.xsd. That's the one we want. Let's open it. Okay. So it gives the full path here, but then we can check the box, use relative path and file location. That's what we want because we make the document and the schema relocatable to different parts of our file system. It sees that it's an XML schema. Okay. And let's click on OK. All right, so what did we get? Well, we got this attribute here. It has the prefix XSI, which means it's in the schema instance namespace because this is an instance document. It is an instance of the document type chapter list. Okay. And that schema doesn't have a target namespace. We're not going to learn how to do that for a couple more units. And so the attribute that points to it is called no namespace schema location. So it points to a schema without a namespace target in it. And we simply have the file name and the file type because it's in the same directory. So that works fine, okay? And if you look at all the elements, I don't have any validation errors on the elements, but what am I having problems with? Well, I'm having problems with every attribute. Oh my, we didn't declare any attributes yet, and we haven't really seen or thought about how we create attributes. Well, it turns out that attributes are pretty easy to do if you already have a complex type, okay? So in all the places where we need attributes, we have a complex type. Okay, so for chapters, let's look up here. We need two we need two attributes. We need source, which I used as a place to put the source that we use for the data, and as of date, okay? And if we look at as of date, this is interesting because this has a particular format. This is the ISO format for date. It is a standard ISO format date. It turns out that XML Schema has a built-in type for those kinds of dates, and we're going to be able to take advantage of that. Okay, pretty neat. We won't do that right away. All right, let's do that. So let's go back. Let's close out all the errors. Okay, and let's go back and see if we can add some attributes. Okay, so if we have a complex type, we can have a sequence, and then we can say what the attributes are. They typically come after the sequence. So we have sequence, and then we just say XS attribute. And of course, the attribute has a name. And the first one is going to be source. And just like the when we declare the elements, we need to give them both a name and a type. So here we're going to say type equal, and for source we're just going to have a normal XS string. And again, just like when we declared an element, we're not going to enclose any text here when we declare an attribute, so we're going to put in the slash to make it an empty element. So that's all we have for source. Although, how do we know if it's required or optional? Well, there's yet one more attribute here. It's called use. And let's take that. And it's optional, prohibited, or required. Well, we want required. So now we're saying that the source attribute is required. Good. And now we have another attribute. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to do that last change. So now we have another attribute. So again, we're going to pick an XS attribute. And we're going to pick a name. And this one is going to be called as of, so AS capital OF. And it has to have a type as well. And let's use, first, let's use a string. Okay? Let's do that. All right, that looks good. So if we do that, we should be able to save this and go back and validate the XML document. And the two errors that we have under source and as of should go away. Well, let's see what happens. Let's click on validate. Yep, they both go away. We haven't fixed this chapter type yet, but we have fixed source and as of. Now, I mentioned before that we have other built-in types, and we have one for date. And date is, it has the format of a standard ISO date, okay, which is just what we have here. Okay, so let's go back, and let's say instead of the as of being XS string, let's say XS date. D-A-T-E. All right, and that's valid in the schema. I just want to point out that when you validate the schema, it really does validate the document because it's a proper XML document, right? So that's a valid schema. And then let's go over to the document, the XML document, and let's validate that again. And of course, that's valid too. But I just want to point out that if we were to say, we were to put the data in another format, like O2/25/2015, okay, whereas that's a valid date format, it's not the valid date format. And you can already see that it's red underlined, okay? And if we go to validate it, it's going to complain that O2/25/2015 is not a valid value for date. Why? Well, because it's not an ISO format date. So I'm going to do some undoing. And now we're back to the ISO standard format for the date. And you can see how the problem has gone away. Okay, so we can say that it's a date and it's going to validate for a date. Okay. For instance, I don't think we can say that we want the 13th month either. Okay. No, we can't. See, we're already red underlined. So let's go back to O2/15. Can we say that we want the 30th day of February? No, we can't. Can we say we want the 29th day of February, even though there were only 28 days this year? No, we can't do that. Can we say that we want to do the 28th? Yeah, we can. So it's pretty smart validation. It has to be a valid date. So I'm going to back up again and get the proper date with some undos. I need to do a redo, edit, redo. There we are. So that's all done. Okay, so now we're down to just the chapter type. That's the only thing that's not currently validating. Let's get rid of the errors so we can see more of the document. Just the chapter types are not working. Okay, so let's add that. And we're going to do that in 2 stages too, okay? So the chapter type this is a little confusing because we have something called a chapter type already, but that's a global type for a chapter. Interesting. So let's see, we've got chapters. It's multiple chapter. Now here's the contents of chapter. It's made up of a sequence and, oh, let's put an attribute on it too after the sequence. Now, I always thought that I wanted to put the attribute before the sequence, but that does not work. It comes after the sequence. So this is the attribute, and again, it's got a name. Okay. And this is a chapter type. Okay, and then it's got a type, and let's say that it's a string. For right now, that's the version we're going to use, and it's an empty element. Okay, so it looks like we've got chapter type covered. Let's go back and take a look at the document, and let's validate it again. And you know, that's gone away. Well, that's great. So we've got a fully valid document. Now, I want to explore one more feature. Chapter type says student, okay? One would think that you just can't type anything there. So what kind of chapters could we have? Well, we could probably have student chapters and regular chapters, okay? Well, wouldn't this be a great situation to create a string type that we restrict to only having the values student or regular? Create an enumerated type. Well, how could we do that? Well, this is what we're going to have to do. Instead of saying that the type is XS string, we're going to have to define a global type for it. Okay. It's a pretty simple idea. Equals that. Let's get the text back. Now, what's the name? Well, it's the type for chapter type. So what's that called? This is a little confusing to some people, but it is properly called chapter with a capital C type. So this is the type for chapter type. Okay, chapter type. Now, some people go absolutely insane over this. Not me. I'm okay. So chapter type. All right. Is this going to be a complex type or a simple type? Well, it turns out that the type of all attributes is simple because it's just plain old characters. Can we put, can attributes have attributes? No, they can't. Can attributes have sub-elements? No, they can't. Oh, so the only type we can have for an attribute is the name of a simple type. So we're finally going to get to declare XS simple type. Okay, name equals, oh, it's our old funny name friend, chapter type. Let's copy that and put that in there. Okay, now, what are we going to get in there? Well, we're going to have a restriction, XS restriction of a plain old character string. So it says the base equals what? Plain old XS string. Okay. And then the information about how we're going to restrict it, we're going to enclose inside the start tag and the end tag. And how did we do that in the lecture? Well, to refresh your memory, we did that with an XS enumeration. So let's have an XS. And again, these autocompletes are a godsend because they only show you what can fit here. So let's say XS enumeration. Okay. Value, the first one is student. Okay. And again, this is going to be an empty element as well. It doesn't enclose anything. And then the second one, I'm just going to copy and change because I'm a lazy typist. And the second one is you can either have a student chapter or you can have a regular chapter. All right. So let's see the testing of this. This should be valid as well. Let's go back and let's validate. So yeah, I've got all student chapters, so they should all validate, and they all do. What if I change the first one to say regular? It should validate too, would you agree? Well, let's just make sure it does. It validates. And what if we put some arbitrary character string here, like my famous hi mom? Will that validate? We already see from the red squiggly line that it won't. Okay? And if you look at the first of the error messages down in the box, it says it's not facet valid with respect to enumeration student, comma, regular. So it's not in that list. Okay, so let's change it back to student because that's what we want. Sorry, student. Okay, that's what it's supposed to be. And now we're validating it. Okay, so now we validate and everything is hunky-dory. So let's just, before we finish up here, let's just peruse the schema that we have and see what we have. Well, first of all, in terms of elements, the only element that we declare globally is chapters, okay? That means that you can only associate this with an XML document that has a root element called chapters, okay? Because we don't have any other element names that are global. Everything else is local. It can't be seen at the top level. So that's good for validation, okay? In terms of local declarations, well, the declaration for the sub-elements in chapters, we use a local definition. For chapter type is a local definition. Advisor type has a local definition. Even character type has a local definition. But these are pointed to because chapter type, advisor type, and chapter type are all defined globally. We can point to them from within the definition of elements. So we see up here under chapters, when we declare chapter, instead of enclosing the type, we point to chapter type. Down here in the chapter type, when we declare advisor and alternate advisor, instead of enclosing the definition of its type, we point to it. And that allows us to use the same global declaration of advisor type for both advisor and alternate advisor, which is, I think, a good idea. And then with advisor type, we're able to point to that. And then we declared the attributes, okay? And remember, because these declarations say that they're complex types, they can have a sequence, and after the sequence come the declaration of the attributes. So on the declaration for chapters, we've got two attributes, source and as of. Oh, and you know what? I never said that as of was required. So it's very nice that I added that. Would have been nice to test that, I guess. All right, and then let's look on chapter type. I did the same thing. I never said that that was required either. So use equals required. So just in reviewing this, we see that these are required. So the first two attributes that we used, source was a string, as of was a date, and because of that, it had to have that ISO date format. And then for chapter type, we created a custom type, which we called the funny name chapter type, and that was a simple type because attribute values are only text, so they're simple types, but it was a restriction of a string, and we restricted it with a two-value enumeration having the value student and the value regular. And then we did some testing of that. Now, you can see that we didn't test whether the attributes were required, because had I left the attributes off, they would have passed my test. And now I just want to, one more check, I want to check the schema. Is it valid? Yeah, it's an Excel document. It's valid. So let me save that. And I want to go back to the XML document and I want to say, is that valid? And yes, it is. And I'm going to save that. So the assignment that we have for this week is kind of parallel. It's similar to what we did when we were doing the DTD version. And I am going to say bye until we get to the demo for the next unit. So bye-bye.